Today Matter.
All right, good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank Eddie and Thula for organizing this, and the University of Pretoria for hosting us. It's good to see some old friends and to meet some people I've heard about for many years, and to meet some new people. What I'm presenting today actually was intended to be part of my book that came out a couple of years ago and recently came out in paperback. But there were all sorts of last-minute twists and turns and bumps in the road, and I ended up cutting out about 200 pages of the book manuscript. But fortunately, they found a new life here. So I want to just more or less read the introduction and then go through some slides quickly and then read the conclusion. I will say one other thing, though. I know a long time has passed since I started this project because my daughter wasn't born when I started, and now she's almost 14. And I didn't need reading glasses when this started, and now I do. So I actually can't see you, which is probably good, but I can see this. So anyway, Seeking Independencies, Kaunda Regime's Global Diplomacy, 1969 to 73. You're all quite familiar with the geography, but it's very important to remember when we think about Zambia. So Seeking Independencies, after Zambia gained political independence from England in 1964, Kenneth Kaunda and his UNIP soon faced a major challenge when neighboring Rhodesia unilaterally declared independence. Kaunda and his colleagues saw little diplomatic success initially regarding Rhodesia, but in 1969 they entered an extraordinary 4-year era involving efforts to achieve one form of independency or another. The key goals included Cold War non-alignment, economic self-sufficiency, regional decolonization, and complete control at home. Mixed results of KK's global diplomacy with complete political control at home, a seemingly robust economy, and substantial global prestige, with Kaunda a key player in the non-aligned movement. Zambian officials had high hopes for a timely resolution in Rhodesia in the early 1970s, but the time was not right. Between 1969 and 1973, Kenneth Kaunda and his regime experienced mixed success, seeking a wide range of independencies. However, his efforts to facilitate a timely resolution in Rhodesia fell short due mostly to circumstances beyond his control. So one of the key points early on in the story is the relationship with China. In 1967, the PRC had offered to construct the Tazara Railroad. And then jumping into the chronological part of my story here, in 1969, Philemon Ngoma became Zambia's first ambassador to the PRC. And this is a photo of KK shaking hands with Mao a few years later. This is from August 1973, when the railroad line first reached the Zambian border, to much acclaim. Many of the details had been worked out by Ambassador Ngoma and Zhou Enlai. This positive Zambia-PRC relationship gave KK's global diplomacy a crucial boost. The Lusaka Manifesto we've talked about a bit today already. So April 1969, leaders of 13 African nations convened in Lusaka. Kaunda opened the gathering with a speech warning of a ticking time bomb. I'm sure he got out his handkerchief and shed some tears, which are oftentimes legitimate. Kaunda worked with Julius Nyerere to craft a 24-point resolution known as the Lusaka Manifesto, espousing diplomacy and negotiations rather than warfare, but again, there's some skepticism. So we'll see what people think. Both the OAU and the UN endorsed the Lusaka Manifesto. Meanwhile, in New York, Vernon Mwanga took over as Zambia's ambassador. He had already served as ambassador to the Soviet Union as a 20-year-old. So there he is in 1968. And during his tenure at the UN, Mwanga, known as VJ, participated in many crucial debates. He presented Kaunda's position on the conflicts in Angola, Mozambique, and Rhodesia, among others. He served as Kaunda's foreign minister later, 1974 to 75, and would then hold that same post in the 1990s. Back in the year 2002, I was here visiting my friend Jackie Hrobler, and he took me to a used bookstore, and I found this book, and it's one of the greatest sources I've ever found. Not that I believe everything VJ says, but incredible detail. From the U.S. side, part of my focus in the paper, and I'll get through it and hopefully quickly enough here, was the neglect and indifference, let's say, of Nixon. But there were U.S. officials who were very interested and directly involved, including Charles Diggs, who was a congressman from Michigan, and he visited Zambia in 1969, and he wanted to learn about the Portuguese attacks onto Zambian soil firsthand. He spoke with Kaunda and asked for a plane, or he expressed interest in going to Eastern Province, and Kaunda offered a plane in any case. He visited the village of Katete, which is where my wife's aunt lives. So I've actually been to Katete, and Diggs was there and saw evidence of the bomb damage. We saw obvious evidence of bombing damage. We saw fragments of bomb shells. We saw craters in the earth, damage to residences, etc. All right, so jumping ahead a bit, Kaunda, I think encouraged by Charles Diggs' interest, then wrongly thought that the visit by Secretary of State William Rogers signaled a great uptick in U.S. interest. It couldn't be further from the truth. But anyway, there's William Rogers. He was the Secretary of State, but he really had no influence over the Nixon White House. I think Nixon and Kissinger spent more time making fun of Rogers, as well as George Bush, who was the UN ambassador, than they did actually dealing seriously with any of their ideas. So the Nixon priorities were definitely not Southern Africa. A very different case, though, moving into the spring of 1970, was a relationship between Zambia and Yugoslavia, who we've heard about today also. And so here's Kaunda meeting with Tito. Unlike Western powers, Tito provided Zambia with jet fighters and training for pilots. Yugoslavia also supplied Zambia with anti-aircraft guns and other weapons. I'm not sure if those were communist weapons. I guess they were non-aligned weapons. But there was more assistance as well. And some of Kaunda's diplomats like Elijah Mudenda and Gray Zulu visited Yugoslavia many times and negotiated some of these other agreements, repair of the roads that had been bombed, and even the funding of the Kafue hydroelectric plant. Probably the biggest project that Tito and Kaunda discussed was the upcoming non-aligned conference. And Tito agreed to provide considerable support and help complete construction of Mulungushi, where they would have the conference. And Kaunda opened this non-aligned summit in September 1970. And we can certainly debate how successful this was or wasn't. Mixed reviews. I'm playing with PowerPoint. You see I've used two different colors. Sort of on the plus side, I suppose. Kaunda hosted 25 heads of state, including Tito, largest conference in Africa up to that time. There were strong calls from the non-aligned movement to reduce global economic disparity, which I think we're all still dreaming about now. Heavy focus on Southern African struggles for independence. On the other hand, some members of the opposition in Zambia, which they actually did have at that time, like Edward Liso, criticized the conference as a waste of money. He also accused Kaunda of hiring prostitutes for the attendees. And Kaunda surely has done many things that we might criticize, but I doubt very much that he did that, but oh well. Anyway, long-term success of the non-aligned movement can be debated. Moving forward a bit here, new U.S. ambassador to Zambia, Oliver Troxell. And Kaunda met with him and talked about a trip that he was going to take to the West and all of his goals. This was quite a whirlwind tour through Europe and New York. He was going to speak at the UN, and that he hoped he could meet with Nixon. The trip started off pretty well in Rome, which seems like always a good place to start a trip. Getting some agreement to cut aid for a dam in Mozambique. In Paris, he had a good talk with the leadership there and got an agreement, although I'm not sure it was honored. I'm sure many of you know more about that than I do. But at least there was a sense on Kaunda's side that they had agreed to stop selling helicopters to South Africa. And then here he is in West Germany, and they didn't necessarily agree, but they agreed to disagree, and it was very amicable. So it's a good start. But then in England, it takes a turn for the worse. According to Kaunda, he was so disgusted by Edward Heath that he walked out before dessert. Now, I know from several other examples that I've researched that Kaunda's memory is not always 100% accurate, but, I don't remember what I did yesterday. So we can think about the importance of being careful with oral history, I suppose. I mean, it's incredibly helpful and important, but anyway, we have to deal with it carefully. So I'm not sure if Kaunda walked out before dessert, but anyway, the meeting did not go well. And then it got even worse. Because his team had been unable to arrange a meeting with Nixon, and surely a lot of that had to do with Nixon's priorities not being on Africa. So there's no meeting with Nixon, and Kaunda announced at the UN that it was a discourtesy to Africa, and that Nixon did not want to see our ugly faces. On the other hand, while Nixon snubbed Kaunda developed a very good relationship with the godfather of soul, James Brown, who came to Zambia. And this starts to lead into one of my points in the paper, that in the early 1970s, Zambia held a place that's almost hard to believe in the global imagination. If you're familiar with the Black Panther movie, sort of Wakanda, but we'll come back to that. So here's the Godfather of Soul in action in Zambia. Mulungushi Hall, which had been built for the Non-Aligned Conference, turned out to be a good place for James Brown. And I would never have gotten this photo if I hadn't spoken to my Uncle Zulu, who, you want to talk about somebody who doesn't remember what they did yesterday, unfortunately, but he remembered the exact date of the James Brown concert, which allowed me to find the newspaper in the Zambian National Archives, right, which has no index. So I think it's in addition to just a fun little trivia, it's important in terms of the role of culture and the cultural connections between African Americans and the African diaspora more broadly, and Zambia in particular, but Southern African blacks in general. And he wasn't the only example. Before Brown played in Lusaka, Arthur Ashe, the great tennis player, had given demonstrations in Lusaka. And a couple years later, Duke Ellington would play a very important concert. I'm glad to see my friend Jackie has returned, because we've been listening to Harry Belafonte at his house during the braai the other day. And so this is another example of this connection between the African diaspora and Zambia. This is Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier visiting with Vernon Wanga to talk about a possible making of a film, which ended up not working out. But. So is this Zambia or Wakanda? And we can ponder that later. Another interesting example, though, was Muhammad Ali actually inquired about fighting in Zambia. He was denied, and I could speculate on why that was, but we'll save that. Successful diplomacy in the meantime, still Vernon Wanga at the UN, negotiating with Portugal to renew access to the sea through Mozambique. Mwanga had many meetings with Portuguese officials, and I've heard from not only Vijay but also from Mark Chona how much how important they think this diplomacy was, let's say. How successful it was, again, I think some people might not see it as they do. In terms of Washington, D.C. and the Nixon administration, things go from bad to worse. We'll hear from Eddie, I think, more about the Byrd Amendment, but there's a great heap of chromium ore there, which would be allowed into the United States after the Byrd Amendment. From Kaunda's perspective, this is just going from bad to worse. And in a great analysis by a Zambian official, the key question was, on whose side are you, Mr. Nixon? So there's the famous Senator Harry Byrd Jr., who passed the amendment, which provided an economic and morale boost to Ian Smith. And I think the term earlier was moral. So maybe it's also a moral boost for Ian Smith. Zambian diplomats criticized this as evidence of Nixon's friendliness to white regimes. In terms of domestic politics, Kaunda was, moving towards one-party rule, and in by-elections in December 1971, UNIP won all of the seats except one. But the shocking exception was Simon Kapwepwe winning a seat. And if you know you all know Zambian history enough, this is a big deal. Kaunda responded by banning Kapwepwe's party. I wish Miles Larmer was here, right? He's written a lot about this. And then Kapwepwe was arrested. And this moves very quickly to the one-party rule. Just in time for the arrival of UN Ambassador George H.W. Bush, who showed up in February 1972. Tough time to visit Zambia. And he called it a great exercise in keeping one's temper. Kaunda praised Nixon's diplomacy with China, but very stridently criticized the U.S. for its apathy towards Southern Africa. Bush was impressed by Kaunda's concern, yet he was irritated by Zambia's criticism of the USA at the very time Kaunda was implementing one-party rule. Kaunda hoped Bush could influence positive change in Nixon's approach, but just like Secretary of State Rogers, Bush had zero influence. The discussion between Kissinger and Nixon about George H.W. Bush, it's not shocking because you all know the things that Nixon said behind closed doors, but anyway, it's still amazing to me. Again, this moment in time for Zambia, it's very interesting. I mean, I'm reminded of Expectations of Modernity, right? Ferguson's book, and just this moment for Zambia, things had not crashed yet, and the kwacha was worth $1.4, and of course the power came from copper. Rising fortunes, expectations of modernity. We have the skyscrapers going up in Lusaka, and those skyscrapers require elevators, and I find that to be a very kind of snazzy symbol of modernization and development. The elevators in Zambia at independence were 60, and by 1972 there were 180. From the U.S. diplomatic side, a new ambassador, Jean Wilkowski, arrived, and she was the first U.S. female ambassador to an African country. Now, Kaunda did appreciate that, but he also delayed recognizing her for over a month while he immediately recognized the new Chinese ambassador. So a lot of drama. Shortly after she took her post, Robert McNamara visited. And funnily enough, I spoke with the late Jean Wilkowski on the phone. I did a phone interview and I asked her about McNamara's visit. She said, "Oh, he never visited." Well, I wasn't going to question her on the phone. She was, 95 years old. But I just noted it. Again, an example of, oral history shouldn't be your only source, I guess is what I'd say. I had a photo of McNamara standing at State House in Zambia in my hand while I was talking to her, but she didn't know that. So anyway, my wife ended up helping me out with some research in some newspapers, and we got the full story of the McNamara visit. Long story short, Kaunda and his economic advisors wanted a lot of help from the World Bank. They got a little bit of help. There you go. Now, back to our real focus here, right, with Rhodesia. January 9th, 1973, Ian Smith closed the border between Rhodesia and Zambia. He wanted Kaunda to guarantee that he wasn't hosting guerrillas. On February 4th, Ian Smith offered to reopen the border, and Kaunda closed the other side. So he felt emboldened to take a stronger stand. Yet the economic collapse was right around the corner. And so in 1973, Kaunda sent Mark Chona and Lashoma on this great global jaunt to seek support from every corner and under every rock. They got almost nothing in the US. They got very little from the Soviet Union, very little from England, more from Northern Europe, and the most help from the PRC. So Lashoma said that real independence would only be achieved with economic self-sufficiency. And in a way, that's why I still don't feel like I'm independent from my parents, because I do not have, oh, never mind, you get the idea. This remains a distant dream, right? It certainly was a distant dream for Kaunda in Zambia in 1973. I mean, there were signs of, this modernity, but really had not been achieved. Now, another thing we've heard about was Zambia's support for the armed struggle and the Kamwala Liberation Center, which is ironically an area where you can shop for all sorts of Chinese products now in Lusaka, was the headquarters for the freedom fighters, including the aforementioned Nkomo, right? Kissinger, and we're near the end, and Kissinger comes into the story. He had dutifully ignored Southern Africa along with Nixon for several years. But in the fall of 1973, he became Secretary of State, and by then it was very clear that Nixon was on his last gasp. So Kissinger was sort of the only star in town for quite a while after that point, and won the Nobel Peace Prize. But just as he was winning the Nobel Peace Prize, he went to Portugal to meet with Caetano, right, who was mentioned earlier. And from the record of the conversation, it's very clear that Kissinger knew next to nothing about Southern Africa. Really remarkable. So here's Caetano giving a tutorial to Kissinger during a lengthy conversation at the palace. Caetano discussed Portugal's challenges in Mozambique and Angola. He enlightened Kissinger on the fact that Angola and Zambia shared a border of some 700 miles. Kissinger didn't know there was any border. That's kind of remarkable. But anyway, there you go. Caetano warned Kissinger, Zambia is one of the worst because Kaunda is both convincing and charming. Portugal's leader concluded, the psychological instability of a man like Kaunda is dangerous. Well, I mean, that's a matter of opinion, how much of that you agree with. But what I find fascinating is here's Kissinger, the pupil, learning about the geography of Africa from Caetano, and then being warned about the psychological instability of Kaunda, who becomes one of Kissinger's best friends very soon after. So if you tell Kissinger that someone is psychologically unstable, it's likely that he'll turn around and be their best friend, I guess. I don't know. So amazing but true. In 1976, it would be, in fact, Kissinger working closely with Kaunda, who made a major contribution to the eventual resolution. So mixed results. The efforts of the Kaunda regime to facilitate peace, majority rule, and independence for soon-to-be Zimbabwe between 1969 and 1973 reveal much about the history of Southern Africa and the region's place in the story. First, Zambia as a nation was in a remarkable situation. And I just put this in here for my daughter and my wife. Not unlike Wakanda in the recent Black Panther film, the economy centered on copper mining showed immense promise. Zambian culture attracted the attention of major icons from the African diaspora. Kaunda himself played a key role in the non-aligned movement, successfully hosting a global conference in 1970. Kaunda's regime took a strong stand against Ian Smith by closing the border in 1973 and then sought economic assistance from all corners of the globe. But no solution. While Kaunda's relations with China bloomed, his relationship with other major powers hit rock bottom. In great part because Nixon decided to keep Africa off the agenda, Kaunda got no real support from Washington. In fact, things took a turn for the worse due to the Byrd Amendment's passage. Kaunda's unique government further complicated matters by initiating strict one-party rule in Zambia. Finally, circumstances were simply not ripe for resolution, as the various sides in Rhodesia were not ready to settle at the end of 1973. Kaunda regime's global diplomacy between 1969 and 73 was in many ways remarkable, but due mostly to reasons beyond its control, it could not facilitate a solution in Rhodesia. All right. I'll put on my other glasses so I can see you.
Hi, thanks very much for a really interesting talk. I hope to, if it's possible, ask a question and then maybe give a comment if I need to. But I just wanted to ask you what kind of sources you looked at when you were discovering this seemingly disastrous Heath Kaunda summit. What kind of things did you look at?
That's why I was sort of guarded in agreeing that he had left before dessert. I've been able to verify that his version of the meeting with Lyndon Johnson in December of 1964 was not really accurate, and so I think that might also be true in this case. It doesn't take away from the certain fact that he didn't like Heath and he disagreed with Heath. I'm sure that's all true, but I've not looked at British sources.
So the comment I'd make in that is that your account, what you said, absolutely corroborates what Peter Carrington says in his memoirs, down to the analogy of Heath getting incredibly angry at Kaunda for arriving at the airport and saying that he'd come to speak to the British public almost over the government's heads over arms sales, but even down to like storming out before dinner, that exactly fits with that. So
excellent.
I'd say go and have a look at that.
It only proves my point that oral histories are always accurate.
Well, thank you, Andy, for a really interesting paper. I enjoyed reading it. Although I did have two questions that arose out of it. Where you mentioned the construction of Kafue, for example. Mm-hmm. And you say the Zambian government got help from Yugoslavia. Well, I wasn't so sure about that. Maybe you share those sources with me. But in my own reading of the construction of Kariba Dam, mm-hmm. It was a two-phase construction, right? And the first phase, of course, was supported by the World Bank. The second phase was problematic, particularly because it was after Zambian independence. And when the Zambians approached the World Bank, this time under McNamara, they were initially rejected, particularly because the first phase was under the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. But it was McNamara, as far as I've found in the documents, who then facilitated a sort of conference between the British, the Rhodesians, who they were very careful not to give, not to recognize, especially after their Republican status after March 1970. So I'm not sure how to reconcile that. It appears like the World Bank eventually gave them something like 120 million towards Kafue, mm-hmm. but I don't know about Yugoslavia. That's the first thing. The quickest, the second one and quick one has to do with the question of whether the Zambian economy had a lot of potential because of copper, or it was actually its Achilles heel, especially given what happens after the 1970s.
Well, those are both great questions. I think I'm a little confused if there's a little overlap between Kariba and Kafue in terms of the dams, but as far as Kafue goes, I'd be happy to share any sources that I have about the Yugoslavian role. I'll have to even double check my own notes. And then as far as whether or not the Zambian economy really was so promising or whether it was really just set up for disaster because it was so reliant on copper, I think that's sort of half full or half empty. I guess what would have made the dreams come true is if they had been able to diversify and develop tourism and be more successful with agriculture and so on, and to really become that diversified economy, which really didn't happen. Now, part of the reason that didn't happen, certainly with tourism, has to do with these regional wars. I mean, I have some statistics about the decline in tourism. So on the one hand, it still looks good on the surface and copper's still on the rise, but we know that's going to crash and oil prices are going to go through the roof. And on the other hand, tourism is going down. And yeah, so I think I knew myself that there's a little bit of confusion in the paper about the Zambian economy, but usually when I listen to an economics lecture, I fall asleep after about 5 minutes. So my economic history is kind of a little sloppy in general. But I'll be happy to talk to you more about the sources.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Tinashe, for pointing out the importance of structure. I'm going to go right back to human agency. Andy, a question for us as historians. When we look at past events, the inflection point of 1976, how far do you think we should address this question of personal diplomacy or personalities in diplomacy when you're looking at, should we say, hinge developments and events? Also, should we emphasize particularly the role of the leader, or should we also be looking at tight networks, matrices between officials that support? So rather than looking at, should we say, a particular flamboyant character like Dr. K or KK, should we in fact be thinking about the key supporting players? So to place it more contextually then within those particular diplomatic engagements.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the second question, I think if there's anything that I have tried to do and had some success at doing is to go beyond KK and to engage with the Vernon Mwangas and Mark Chonas and Sateke Mwales of the world and give them a voice. I mean, it's interesting, in the United States, that wouldn't count because I'm still just talking about rich diplomats. They're kind of all the same in the United States. That's one view. This isn't social history. This isn't, really giving the people a voice. But in a case like Zambia, so much of the attention for 50 years has been on KK that I felt like I was kind of breaking some doors down by bringing these other characters into the story who most people outside of Zambia or South Africa had not heard of. The same on the U.S. side to some extent. For example, in the presentation, I've got some of the ambassadors like Jean Wilkowski. And I don't mean to make fun of her in any way. If she didn't remember one little thing, it doesn't matter. I mean, she's a very intelligent woman, and she makes a case that she had kept up a steady drumbeat trying to get Washington to pay attention. And she believed that in some small way she had helped make that happen. And I agree. So I think for that part of the question, I've tried a bit. For the first question, how much should we focus on personality in the history of foreign relations? I've always done it. I'll admit, and I think it may be a bit of a weakness in my own scholarship, but it's always informed my scholarship and my teaching. My initial interest in this whole business came from Peter Gabriel's song "Biko" when I was in college, and then Andrew Young speaking at my college graduation. And with someone like Andrew Young, who's been central to my work for 25 years now, a lot of it has to do with personality and how he's able to connect with anyone. But I think the sort of obvious criticism, which is very valid, is people will look and say, well, but what did he really accomplish? And what has he accomplished by, accusing the British of being racist and, all the things that Andrew Young is famous for doing? So, I'm too old to change anyway. So I'm going to stick with biographies and a lot of personality in my work. But I realize that there are many other approaches and there are critics that have a point. I think you mean the principles themselves, like Andrew Young and Mark Chona, and I think they do. And whether it's Kissinger who believes it because he's so smart, even though he doesn't know that Angola has a border with Zambia, you know, his brilliance will carry the day. And he is brilliant. I mean, I'm not saying he's not. Whereas Andrew Young would say, no, it's about being Christian and being able to get along with everyone, and it's my personality that wins today. I think they do. And I suppose in my heart I agree with them more than not. All right, thank you.